Good to see everyone. I'm going to do a little bit of a recap from last week just to get us back on track. And John was right. We're doing tonight the early medievals. And even though I could cover a lot of the church fathers, what I'm going to do is major in Augustine, since he is my personal favorite and one of the leading voices in the early Middle Ages, and we'll get to sort of more about him in a second. So just a brief recap. I gave you guys a timeline last week and pointed out there were 4 pieces in the history of philosophy. Does anyone remember what the 4 pieces are? Ancients. And that's especially around the 300s BC, Socrates, Plato, who was Socrates' student, and Aristotle, who was Plato's student. Okay, and then the second one? Medievals.
Augustine.
Yes, the big man. Augustine. Augustine and Augustine are both correct pronunciations. I have had endless debates with fellow professors about the question, and some of my favorite Augustine scholars say Augustine, some of my favorite Augustine scholars say Augustine, so I think either way you're safe. Augustine of Hippo, yes. There also is a Augustine and one who is a missionary to England, but that is a different Augustine than the one we're going to study. The other big thinker of the medievals is Aquinas, who we're going to talk about next week. That'll be really exciting. Augustine, one easy way to remember when Augustine is these thinkers of the 300s BC. Augustine is around the 300s AD. And then, third? Moderns. Yes. And this is when you have the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, love of certainty, love of proofs, arguments. In certain ways, philosophy wants to gain the admiration of science as opposed to the other way around. And then fourthly, postmoderns, yes, which is a nice big soup of all sorts of different things. So, last week we talked about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. I would say the primary emphasis was on Socrates and Plato, not because I dislike Aristotle, but partially because I got so excited when we were talking about Plato, and I just went on and on and on and on. Aristotle's amazing, so he could have taken his own 3-hour chunk. We will get a lot more of him next week when we talk about Aquinas. As I said last week, Augustine is a Christian who is appropriating Socrates and Plato, who he came to before he became a Christian and found lots of truth in, and actually through them was led to Christianity. He's asking the question, how much of Socrates and Plato can we keep? How much do we have to throw out now that we are Christians? Aquinas is doing the exact same thing with Aristotle. In fact, he doesn't even refer to Aristotle as Aristotle. He just refers to him as the philosopher with a capital P. So sort of a love affair, I think, a little bit much, but it's also beautiful in a certain way. So we'll get more Aristotle next week when we talk about Aquinas. We'll get some more Plato tonight when we talk about Augustine. So, and maybe a couple more things. Plato and Aristotle and Socrates were concerned with the transcendence. The 3 transcendents that I talked about were truth, goodness, and beauty. Yes. And we talked about how different philosophers emphasize one of these more than the others, and how Plato puts goodness at the top, and is really, for him, it's very important that truth and beauty always submit to goodness, that they kind of be held accountable by goodness, or else they can veer off and be isolated from one another. The other thing we talked about from Plato is his conception of the artist as being inspired by a kind of divine madness, where there is this way in which they lose themselves because there's a feeling of something coming through them that is not from themselves alone. And there's a sort of surrender that happens. And Plato thinks that that is both amazing and beautiful and capable of a lot of things, but on the other hand, very dangerous, depending on the ordering of the soul in which it happens. We also talked about Aristotle's notion of catharsis. So catharsis is a purging that art can do to you by invoking feelings of pity and fear. And so as you feel those deep emotions, and somehow your soul becomes cleansed in the process. And we talked about whether that is in fact true or not. So any questions before we erase this? And we won't forget them, but move on to Augustine. Okay, good. So I want to start with one of the most famous analogies that Augustine gives that I think is appropriate because it sort of sets up the way that he is going to approach the bigger questions that we're going to ask about, in certain ways, I guess, how we approach pagan truth and literature and beauty. So one of the things to just sort of keep in mind is that when Augustine comes around, he's living in Rome, and at the time, Roman culture is burgeoning. He's sort of in the center of where all the life is going on, and he's trained in the liberal arts. He's inspired by Homer and the great philosophers that came before him. So he has this wealth of learning behind him. And then he encounters Christ in the New Testament. And there's something very lowly about the scriptures. And at that point in time, Christianity was still a persecuted minority. And so you have this very famous, Augustine was a very famous orator, politician, known for being extremely eloquent, extremely well educated, who then humbles himself in a lot of ways and becomes a Christian. And is in certain ways ostracized by a lot of the leading scholars of the day who kind of thought he was amazing until he converted. He actually was so eloquent that before he converted a lot of people away from Christianity to other beliefs. And so he sort of spent his life kind of struggling with the fact that he was able to do that. But so in certain ways, Christianity appears to be this sort of poor, intellectually impoverished sort of alternative to this great culture that he is coming after. And so his question is, how much am I going to just be doing a completely different thing and separate myself from the world completely? And how much am I looking, how much of all of the greatness, truth, goodness, and beauty that I've encountered in these thinkers is actually maybe even more Christian than it is pagan, insofar as it is true or good or beautiful? And I think he asks a really good question because we, in our own day, as evangelicals, as Christians, are surrounded by a culture that there's tons of amazing things being made by artists who are not Christians, and writers, and dramatists, and all sorts of things. And so we have to ask the question, can we enjoy these things? How do we enjoy these things? Does it make sense that just as amazing things, if not better, sometimes things can be made by people that don't love God? And what does that mean? So Augustine uses a famous analogy that he takes from the Old Testament, and it is the story of the Egyptians. It's called the Egyptian gold analogy, and it's the story of the Egyptians who, and the Israelites, who when they were slaves in Egypt, were getting ready to flee, and God tells them to ask their neighbors, their Egyptian neighbors, for all of their gold and all of their precious jewels and all of that. He just says, ask for them. and they'll just give it to you before you leave. And it sounds kind of crazy because the Israelites are slaves in Egypt, and they're just being told to ask their neighbors for all of their gold. But it happens. Like, all the Egyptians just give the Israelites their gold. And a lot of this gold are things that the Egyptians used to sacrifice to idols, to do all sorts of things that are not related to Christ at all. But they are given to the Israelites and given to use for the purposes of God as they leave Egypt and travel on their way to the Promised Land. So what Augustine, and I'm going to read the passage, I'm going to explain it a little bit and then read it, but what Augustine is going to argue is that the truths and the goodness and the beauty that's found in pagan literature and art is like the gold of the Egyptians, that actually originally belongs to God and is being used in a way that is different from the way that it was created to be used. And so what Christians are actually called to do is to appropriate those things and put them to their proper use, which is love of and worship of their Creator. So I'm going to read this and then we'll talk. So he says, "Now just as some people have taken all the," hold on, let me make sure I'm starting at the part I want to. No, I'm going to skip down a little. Okay. "If those, however, who are called philosophers happen to have said anything that is true and agreeable to our faith, the Platonists above all, not only should we not be afraid of them, but we should even claim back for our own use what they have said, as from its unjust possessors. It is like the Egyptians, who not only had idols and heavy burdens, which the people of Israel abominated and fled from, but also vessels and ornaments of gold and silver and fine raiment, which the people secretly appropriated for their own, and indeed better, use as they went forth from Egypt. And this not on their own initiative, but on God's instructions, with the Egyptians unwittingly lending them things they were not themselves making good use of. In the same way, while the heathen certainly have counterfeit and superstitious fictions in all their teachings, and the heavy burdens of entirely unnecessary labor, which every one of us must abominate and shun as we go forth from the company of the heathen under the leadership of Christ, their teachings also contain liberal disciplines which are more suited to the service of the truth, as well as a number of most useful ethical principles, and some true things are to be found among them about worshiping only the one God. All this is like their gold and silver, and not something they instituted themselves, but something which they mined, so to say, from the ore of divine providence, veins of which are everywhere to be found. As they for their part make perverse and unjust misuse of it in the service of demons, so Christians for theirs ought, when they separate themselves in spirit from their hapless company, to take these things away from them for the proper use of preaching the gospel. Their fine raiment, too, meaning, that is, what are indeed their human institutions, but still ones that are suitable for human society, which we cannot do without in this life, are things that it will be lawful to take over and convert to Christian use." So, yeah,
One thing.
definitely.
One of the things we hit on in the last 6 weeks when we were talking about the tabernacle was, where did the gold come from? And it was, the only
Wow.
place it really could have come from was
From the Egyptians.
Not only did the Israelites use it for godly purpose, use it for the purpose. The tabernacle, which was the sort of herald and ultimate foreshadowing of Christ himself, who it is said tabernacled with us. So not only was it okay, it was the Holy of Holies.
Wow.
Then we got off into a tangent of, so when did it become like so holy that it killed people?
Right.
It's like, if you were allowed to touch it, it would.
Oh, yeah.
There's this story about it anyway.
Yeah, a person that accidentally touches and then they
But I
like
digress.
fall down dead.
Yes.
Yeah,
When
that's
God's Spirit entered it, probably, wouldn't it?
yeah. When God said so. Yes, yeah. I'm so happy that God's patient and doesn't strike us dead every time we do something that makes him unhappy.
Wouldn't be
Yeah.
left alive.
Yeah, no one would last like 5 minutes. So what I love about this passage is that what Augustine is claiming is that actually none of these things that the pagan or the non-Christian comes upon and creates or writes about, none of it actually is something that is separate from possession by God. that it's actually from God, in God, and we human beings being made in God's image our Creator without even knowing it. And what Augustine's going to say is that it isn't like you have in the world lots of things that are Christian things and spiritual things, and lots of things that are non-Christian things and evil things. He's going to say, no, like all things are created good by God. All things. And the question is, he says, how we use them. So it isn't that certain things have to be abolished. Like we don't abolish, because we have prostitution, we don't abolish sex. Or because we have, what's another example? I mean, gambling. Yeah, we don't abolish money. These things are good, are given by God, and the problem is that they're being misused. So, and misused in a variety of ways, whether to create our own sort of heaven on earth, to worship idols, to worship ourselves, to just feed our own desires and pleasures, whatever it may be. And so he says that when we find these gems, we don't destroy them because we see them in the hands of a pagan. We also don't take them and use them the way they're being misused and sort of follow along and misuse them in the same way. But we put them to their proper use, which he says is to preach the gospel, and ultimately he's going to say to enjoy God, enjoy and worship God. He actually so the book that I was reading from is called De Doctrina Christiana, on teaching Christianity. It's a really incredible book, and it was written later in his life. But one of the distinctions that he makes in it, that he makes in earlier works as well, but makes it sort of more clear here, is that he says everything can be either used or enjoyed, or both. And he says that ultimately, the only thing that should be enjoyed as an end in itself is God. That everything else, everything that is made by God is to be enjoyed, but primarily to be used in order to enjoy God. So if it's never pointing beyond itself, if our delight in the sunset doesn't point beyond itself also to the creator of that sunset, if our delight in music doesn't also point to the one who has perfect, beautiful harmony in his own being, if it's stopping with itself and being enjoyed in itself and not pointing beyond itself, then he thinks that it's being misused. So the point that he's making here then is that just as the Egyptians were taking this gold and putting it to its rightful use, which is to build the tabernacle, to take them to the promised land, that we as Christians are actually kind of obligated to mine the riches of all of everything that's created by human beings. Search for it. Proverbs says to search for wisdom like it's gold and silver. That verse always sort of bothered me because I'm not really someone who actually, I've never liked jewelry that much. I don't really get excited about pretty diamonds and things like that. I like trees, and I like used bookstores. So I always rephrase that verse in my mind as search for wisdom as if it's a used bookstore. So I'm like, okay, that's intense. I can do that, But anyway, but the idea is that we were to gather these things even hungrily. And expect to find them among unbelievers, but with the aim of figuring out how to actually use them the right way, what they were created to be and to do, and that being ultimately enjoyment and worship of God and love of God.
Christy,
Yes.
What you're saying is reminding me of a couple of verses that I think speak to the doctrine of kind of common grace, like
Yes.
the rain falls on the wicked and the righteous. It's not only the righteous that are blessed with smarts or money or fame, or it's sort of given out sometimes at random. There's one more verse I wanted to share. The Psalm 24, verse 1 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. It kind of is part of that very interesting paradox of the Israelites are chosen, and yet God also owns the world.
Right.
And so I love this, that God in all his infinite wisdom did not see fit to bestow only on the religious the intelligence and wisdom and truth.
Absolutely. Yeah, so good. And I think that for me personally, I had hints of this in the way I was brought up in the church, especially some of the ways in which pursuing the arts actually was a big part of, and I think questions of the intellect. But when I did learn about just the idea of common grace in college, that really struck a chord and connected with this idea where everything is graced with divine goodness. Even those who do not put their faith in God, they have it without even knowing it. And so we just shouldn't be surprised when we find truths in Shakespeare and Plato and even in Nietzsche. God love him. So yeah, and I think that what's really awesome about this is it makes the world an exciting place because nothing is off limits for the Christian to find and put to its proper use, and it's almost a cultural mandate. It's a way that we get to participate in God's redemption of culture, where we get to be co-redeemers with him. So the thing that I really like about Augustine is he also thinks that he sees there being also a danger in this. And the danger is actually in the original story of the Israelites, which is that once they leave Egypt and they're traveling in the wilderness, they get really impatient with God when Moses goes up to get the 10 Commandments from him. They don't like waiting on God. They almost long back for their enslavement in Egypt. And what do they do with the gold while he is up talking to God?
Make it in a calf.
Make it into a calf, into an idol. So they don't last very long before they take the gold and put it into its improper use, which I think is a really interesting and important warning towards Christians that while this is an exciting thing, that you don't have to fear pagan art, that you have to know your own sinful nature enough to know that even you are capable of putting it to its improper use and being and it may be especially in times where you're impatient with the feeling of God being distant from you and wanting to create some sense of a feeling of transcendence that is close, that makes you excited, that you feel alive in. And I think art is one of those things that can do that for you. And so, yeah, I think that warning is telling.
If they
Yeah.
made that calf and put it in a museum instead of worshiping it, they would have been okay.
Maybe.
Sort of.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I don't. That's a good question. I mean, so yeah, if they had just created a calf and said, "Look how beautiful the form of the body of this animal is that God created," they might have been okay. Yeah, no, I don't think they would have done that with a cow or a calf. But yeah, right.
The calf was an Egyptian god. I think it was called Apis or something like that.
Was it? Yeah. I mean. And this also gets back to one of the things that Augustine says about us is that we are beings that are designed to worship. And there's almost no such thing as an atheist, that in practical day-to-day life, everyone is worshiping something. And so the question isn't about whether you're worshiping or not, but it's what you're worshiping. And Augustine actually thinks that even Christians who worship the one true God are tempted to worship a sort of multiplicity of things. And so their worship is scattered among lots of different things instead of all moving from the thing itself to this unity in the one God. Everything sort of having, instead of ending in itself, actually pointing back to its original creator. Was there a question over here? Yeah, or a comment?
You may not even want to touch on this. But
Okay.
the subject of enjoyment versus the subject of worship and addiction.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we
Right.
can get addicted to enjoyment.
Right.
You know,
Right.
wine and a good meal,
Yes. Yes. I'm.
or music, or
Yes. Yes. So I totally want to get into that question, and Augustine does too. So a little, and then this that's like, I almost could have paid you to ask me that, to like just go into our next point. So yeah. Okay. All right. Sounds good. So it brings me to this book, which is going to be sort of the center of our discussion tonight. I don't know how many of you have read this. It's the Confessions of St. Augustine. I think, in fear and trembling, I say that I think it's the best book ever written, second to the Bible. I've probably read it 35 times, and every time I read it, almost every single page, I learn something new. And it like hits me, hits my mind, hits my heart, makes me love God more. It's my book's crazily marked up, and so there's a lot here, and it's interesting because when I first read it, I was in this sort of prideful intellectual stage where I was just starting college, becoming a philosophy major, and I was really frustrated with a lot of the like watered down, gooey evangelical devotional stuff, just teen study Bibles and things like that just felt like kind of pandering to my emotions but not engaging me in a full way. And then there's this really like meaty stuff like Aristotle that I could bite my teeth into and have these deep discussions about. And so in my mind I kind of had sort of separated books into gooey emotional literature and serious scholarship kind of thing. Super prideful. So I started reading Augustine, and Augustine, he just cries all the time. Like he always talks about weeping. He wears his emotions on his sleeve. He's more emotional than most women that I know. And when I first started reading it, I was like, oh, like one of these guys. It's so sweet and cute, that you cry about God all the time, but like, what else is there here? And I'm like so embarrassed that I even responded that way. But as I started reading him, I started to see like, well, no, he actually has an astounding intellect, but his love of God is driving it, is driving like everything that he's doing, and the ways in which Christianity is weak and poor and impoverished and suffering and meek, he embraces without fear, and has a humility of spirit that comes before his intellect, although his intellect is very, very strong. And so over time, it convicted me. As I started to read it, I realized that I had separated these categories in my own heart and my own self, and that he actually was putting the two together in this like beautiful marriage that I now like have always wanted to have. Like that's sort of he's one of my role models in that way. So anyway, that's maybe one of the reasons that I love it the most, is that I don't think his philosophy ever takes him away from a heartfelt submission to God and love of God that surpasses everything else. So was there a comment?
well, you probably don't want to go here.
Okay.
But I've often wondered myself about why we have this imagination and these emotions, and why we have this intellect and reason and logic. I think most of us are trying to approach God on a logic, rational approach. The fact that Augustine is feeling his way there, as well as thinking his way there, I think is on course.
Yeah, absolutely,
Because
absolutely.
there's things we're going to learn emotionally that we're not going to get rationally.
Right. And you know, I don't want to make any gender statements, but
Go ahead.
I think sometimes men tend to struggle with embracing that emotional side. I mean, David and Paul in the Bible are maybe would be regarded by men today as like feminine men. I mean, they cry all the time. Paul compares himself to a nursing mother, you know, when he talks about how much he loves his congregations. And but like these are people that are like the biggest representatives of believers, lovers of God, like in the Bible. So I think that's difficult for men. I think women, we're good at emotions, maybe too emotional sometimes. Gotta love us, you know, we know how to cry, but sometimes are a little bit fearful of the intellectual realm, or like afraid to get our like feet wet, and I think that fear is unwarranted because we have intellects to be able to engage those things just fine. And so on both ends, there's this call, I think, in Augustine to step up, to be fully human, to use like our whole selves to pursue him, and to not see any of those things as needing to be set aside in that pursuit. So
I see C.S. Lewis's salvation similar to that. I mean, he came to the point where he intellectually accepted that God existed, but it wasn't until he became vulnerable and transparent,
yeah,
riding in the sidecar on his brother's motorcycle, that
yeah,
made that conversion.
yeah,
And then he, like, was it Augustine that you were saying, was criticized by his scholars, other scholars, because he devoted more time to Christian writing
Yes.
than academic pursuits.
right, absolutely. And yeah, so C.S. Lewis, I think, is a great example. It's interesting because, and I grew up reading C.S. Lewis. My big favorite among that set of authors around that time, the Inklings, is George MacDonald, who was Lewis's biggest influence. Lewis actually called George MacDonald his master, and said that he thought MacDonald understood Christ better than any other author he had read. And I think MacDonald surges the emotions and the intellect even better than Lewis. I think Lewis is a little bit unsure about himself with emotions sometimes, but I do think his story of conversion is definitely that story of surrender, like definitely, and that is in
He had a
him.
difficult childhood with his father.
Yes, yeah, he did. Yeah. So, and his book, The Four Loves, is one of my favorites, and in that he sort of talks about the blending of the two. So, so that's Augustine. The Confessions is Augustine's testimony. It's his story of how God pursued him. He kind of sees himself as a prodigal son, and there's 13 books in the Confessions, and for the first 8, he's running away from God, and it's a story of him sort of retelling that story as one where he's running, but he also sees God pursuing him the whole way, and sort of putting to use even the things that he's misusing in his life. So one of the examples being that he was trained as a liberal arts scholar, and his parents wanted him to be a great politician, to wow people with his rhetoric skills, and he loved to be praised, and he says he loved to shine. And when he became a Christian, he had to set aside those things and not do things for the love of the praise of men, but then those gifts that he developed as a liberal arts thinker and writer made him an amazing writer for Christianity. I mean, he was even when you read the Confessions, you see every single word is there on purpose, and that's partially due to his liberal arts training, his studying Cicero and Homer and all of that. So there's a lot here. We're not going to get to cover all of it, but I want to sort of cover some of the major themes. Okay, first sentence that's big in this book, it happens in like chapter 1, book 1, is kind of Augustine's, one of the things that is at the center of Augustine's philosophy, which is the belief about human beings that he says, this is what he says. He says, "Yet man, this part of your creation, wishes to praise you. You arouse him to take joy in praising you, for you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." So, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts we are restless until we rest in you. So, one of the things that he thinks is central to human existence is this feeling of restlessness, almost a sense of homelessness and loneliness that we feel, that we're in certain ways a hunger that we're always trying to fill. And we sort of move from thing to thing to thing to thing to fill it. So, it might be through love, through marriage, through career, through art, through the intellect, through beauty and nature. Whatever it is that sort of seems to start filling that hunger in us, we sort of flock to it and try to soak up as much as we can of it to maybe see if it fills us. And he thinks that what we actually have sort of a God-shaped hole in our hearts that really can only be filled by God. But what he thinks the problem is that, and this is kind of a big theme in the early fathers, is that in order to pursue God and to see Him as the answer to that hunger, our hearts actually have to be purified in certain ways. And so one of the things that the early fathers talked about when they talked about the pursuit of beauty is that everyone can have a love or liking for beauty. Their soul can be stimulated by that. But that there are lower beauties and there are higher beauties. And not that these lower beauties are less, but for instance, a beautiful body versus a beautiful soul. So there's a scripture in the Bible that says that women are not to braid their hair and pay tons of attention to what they're wearing every day, but are to pursue like the virtue of soul, beauty of soul. And so there's this preference for, and it's not to denigrate the outward appearance, but to say there's something even higher. And what the early fathers talked about is that even higher than any created beauty is the beauty of the Creator Himself, which our souls in certain ways were created to seek and take joy in praising. But what they say is that as sinful beings, we naturally are drawn to fill that hunger or that void with lower beauties, with lower things. And there's a passage where Augustine talks about this. Let me see if I can find it really quick. He often talks about it as a kind of hunger in which he is trying to fill himself, but doesn't realize that he's actually more starving. So this is where he says it. I came to Carthage, where a cauldron of shameful loves seethed and sounded about me on every side. I was not yet in love, but I was in love with love. And by a more hidden want, I hated myself for wanting little. I sought for something to love, for I was in love with love. I hated security and a path free from snares. For there was a hunger within me from a lack of that inner food, which is yourself, my God. Yet by that hunger I did not hunger, but was without desire for incorruptible food. Not because I was already filled with it, but because the more empty I was, the more distaste I had for it. Therefore my soul did not grow healthy, but it was ulcered over, and it cast outside itself, and in its misery was avid to be scratched by the things of sense. things that would not be loved if they lacked all soul. To love and to be loved was sweet to me, and all the more if I enjoyed my loved one's body. So he's describing himself, and I'm an artist, but whenever I draw, when I'm teaching, I can't draw at all. Like, I lose all artistic talent whatsoever. So I'm doing stick people tonight. Yeah, it is minimalist. Maybe I'm taking a modern approach. I don't know. So here you. What?
Let me be honest.
No. Okay. So, and actually, I shouldn't put a smile, because he's actually pretty unhappy in this passage. So he says that he's empty. Like, inside of him, he's empty. And he feels empty. He actually doesn't want security. He doesn't want a path free from snares. He actually wants a path with snares in it, interestingly. And he's hungry for love. So what he says is what he really needs is what he's going to call either inner food or incorruptible food. That's what he really needs. But he says by actually needing that, he actually doesn't feel a hunger for it. He feels a hunger for outer or corruptible food. He mentions bodies, things that are related to his five senses. So first question is, what is inner incorruptible food? What is outer corruptible bodily senses kind of food? He uses this food metaphor a lot in his works, actually. I think I love it. So what would be the difference between those two?
For example, for inner food would be the Word of God, obviously.
Okay. Yeah, the Word of God, because it is the same.
Spiritual nourishment.
Yeah, it's feeding the Spirit, and really sort of the ultimate inner food is Christ, right? That's what our souls are hungry for. That's what we need. That's what won't ever corrupt, won't ever fall away. Corruptible food.
What if somebody doesn't know Christ? What if somebody's never been they've never been exposed to?
Right.
Christ. They've
Well,
never been exposed
yeah.
to the Word. They've never.
Right.
They don't know Jesus.
Right.
They don't have a word for God.
Right. So this Augustine at this stage, that's him. So as he's describing himself here, he says he was hungry, and it was almost like he was roaming around like a beast, starving. And what he didn't know he was starving for was that he was starving for Christ. But he didn't know that. And what he really felt like, and actually he says he had a distaste for his impulse was to push away the very thing that he needed. And his impulse was to take in more and more and more and more of the thing that he talks about it being like scratching an itch and it ulcering over. So a thing that is going to have a temporary bandage, but not heal, not actually do surgery on his heart and give it what it needs. So what he's going to say is that even the person that doesn't know Christ is hungry because we've been made for Christ. Like we've been created for him. And so they're hungry for him, and they don't even know it. They don't even know that's what, when they feel loneliness, when they feel homesick, when they feel like, even that feeling where you meet someone and you're like, oh, maybe they'll complete me, that Augustine's going to say that deep down in the deepest recesses, you're starving, and you're starving for Christ.
And you're going to try to fill that with the
Yeah.
corruptible.
Yep, you are.
That's where you get into dreaming and sex.
Yes, and it's things related to the senses, and this is what's tricky for the artist, is that art often appeals to the senses. Okay, so music. I mean, and you were talking about addictions. I mean, music and amazing food.
Enjoyment. I'm just talking about.
Enjoyment. Right, enjoyment of any of these things. These are things that they do, like, somewhat like touch that hunger in us, and they don't have to be a replacement for the inner food or the incorruptible food. But what Augustine was experiencing, and maybe what anyone is tempted to do, is to sort of go hungrily after those things to cover over a wound or a hole that actually needs to be filled in a much deeper way. And I think, and we talked a little bit about this last week, about how to create art that you sort of idolize as a thing in itself versus how to create art that points beyond itself to the creator. And so Augustine's going to ask this question later on: what things, in what way are we to enjoy things that push us, instead of satisfying us in a very temporary way, actually make us hungrier for inner incorruptible food? Because what he was experiencing was that these things were placating that hunger, not for very long. I mean, he was miserable, but placating it, and even making incorruptible food feel more distasteful. So it's almost like when you eat junk food, you don't want to eat the salad. The salad just, it's like, I want fries, I want chicken nuggets or whatever, and you sort of have to force yourself to get rid of those things and to eat the salad. And it's really takes a while for your body to change to where it actually craves those healthy things instead of those unhealthy things.
Sin is pleasurable for a season.
Right, yes, absolutely. Well, and he's not even talking necessarily here about sin, but
Or use of anything.
yeah, but it's all about the use, which we said again, the use and enjoyment. So
Does,
yeah.
Does Augustine use the word a hole in your heart, or is that I've heard that used a
Right,
lot of
right.
times. Is that some
A
other
God-shaped hole. He doesn't have. I mean, I feel like God-shaped hole is sort of like evangelical. It's the type of thing we come up with that sounds really gimmicky or whatever. But so I don't know if he has that exact phrase, but that meaning is pulsing through his work. I mean, it's everywhere there.
That particular phrase?
I don't remember. I've just heard it a lot. I actually think it's true, though.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
It sounds sappy, but it's true.
Yeah. Yes.
Couldn't your inner food that's incorruptible move up to the corruptible if you go to excess? Because there
So,
are people I know that
right.
do that.
Yeah. So, but that's true. So there, and actually, it's interesting because he's going to say, and we'll talk about this in a second, but he talks about 3 sins that he thinks are the most prominent sins, and the kind of the root of all the other sins that we have, and those are lust, curiosity. This is the one that we never think of as, and I'll talk about why he thinks it is a sin, and what he means by it. And then, of course, pride. Now, lust is something that is very bodily, is very connected to the corruptible things to a certain degree. I think curiosity actually can take the form of either the bodily or the intellectual or spiritual realm. I think people often move from religion to religion because they're just curious and they get bored. Pride is really primarily a spiritual sin. It's something that we do with our heart, with our mind, not really, and it sort of takes root and causes other things that are related to the body. But yeah, so you can have things that are incorruptible that are still evil or still misused. I don't think, though, you can get addicted to Christ in a bad way.
Well, you can get addicted to the church.
So, but that's different, right? So that still would be loving the creation more than the Creator. So his big thing is, the big divide is between the Creator and the creation, and he basically says it's lower things and the highest thing, and he actually thinks that the better the thing that's created, the easier it is to make it an idol, because it's even closer to what you're supposed to love, like a spouse, I mean, it's good to love your spouse, And it makes more sense to love them than to love someone who's not your spouse, but even loving your spouse more than you love God, or feeling like you would die without them versus you would die without God, is an idol. So that's a good question. Yes?
Well, it's interesting to me. It seems like the outer corruptibles give us a promise of something and a precursor to, but it almost takes divine revelation to give the incorruptible.
Yeah,
So even
yeah.
in Romans, when it says you have no
Right.
excuse because I've kind of hemmed you in.
It's clearly evident.
It's clearly there, but at some point, we have to have something intervene.
Yeah.
That we see that, like even good artists,
Mhm.
a lot of times you're so taken with good art or good
Mhm.
movies or so, because it takes you to the kind of the edge of
Right.
truth, but it doesn't move over.
Yep,
It
yep.
doesn't make that commitment to what it, I don't know.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah. No, I know what you're saying. Yeah, you're absolutely right. He's actually going to say that this is one of the ways in which Christianity is very different from the Platonists, because the Plato and Aristotle, they're going to see this journey towards the good, the true, and the beautiful as one that you undertake, and you undertake it through your intellect, through your acts, through your decisions, and so you sort of get yourself there. And Augustine is going to say that we're hopeless if we're expecting to get ourselves there, and really his story is that he didn't run to God. He ran away from God, and in running away from God, God pursued him and found him. And so he needed a sort of overwhelming miracle of a divine gift in order to find that. And actually, I want to read a passage that I think that points really well to that. So,
After finding it, some of my
Yes.
friends from other religions say that we are totally, whenever you talk about those words, that by our search for inner food, we are so addicted that we have blindsided anything
Yeah.
that might include them.
yeah,
That we don't have the ability, we are addicted
Yeah.
to that inner food.
Yeah.
And thus our lives are very narrow and
Yeah.
very focused and very unacceptable
Mhm.
to the world in general.
yeah. No, that's so our lives are very narrow and unacceptable to the world because we're addicted to inner food. Okay,
And that
so that.
only being
Yeah, Christ. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, on the second page of the Confessions, Augustine says, he doesn't say he needs to be convinced by an argument, a really, really good argument that Christ is the one. He actually says his soul is too small, and that he says, too narrow is the house of my soul for you to enter into it. Let it be enlarged by you. So he doesn't even have room. Even if he was presented with the best argument in the world, he has a tiny soul, and he needs God to actually make it bigger. And I actually think this is something that art can do. Like I think art can make the imagination explode, like and widen in a way that allows for the divine to enter in a way that it wasn't ready to enter before, and can do that sometimes in a way that rational arguments can't. So I think art has a definite power to do this. My daughter, when we were walking in today, she was looking at the American flags that were outside, and it was reminding her of some conversations we had about American history. And she's like, "Mom, I like history, but I don't like it as much as art and philosophy and literature." And I was like, "Huh? Like, why is that?" And she's like, "Well, history is about what has been, but art and philosophy and literature are about what could be." And she said they make my imagination explode, or whatever. And I was like, Aristotle would agree with you, Augustine would agree with you. You're in good company, So she was happy about that. So. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to read from this. This is book 5, chapter 2, and I love this passage for a lot of reasons, but I think it points to something that the Platonists don't even have on the map. Plato and Aristotle don't even have on the map, which is not only did they not have a personal God, but they don't have a God that empties himself and chases after us to find us and to bring us back to him. So he says, and he uses the metaphor of rest and restlessness in this too, which I really like. So he says, the wicked who are without rest may go their way and flee from you, but you see them and pierce the shadows. Behold, all things about them are beautiful, but they themselves are vile. How have they done injury to you, and in what way have they disfigured your sway, which is just and perfect from the heavens even down to the lowest depths? Whither did they flee when they would flee from your face? Or where would you not find them out? But they fled away so that they might not see you who see them always, and that being blinded they might stumble upon you, for you forsake nothing that you have made. That they, the unjust, might stumble upon you and thus be justly troubled, withdrawing themselves from your gentleness, stumbling against your righteousness, and falling upon your severity. In truth, they do not know that you are everywhere, for no place can enclose you, and that you alone are present, even with those who have set themselves far from you. Let them be converted then, and seek you, for you have not forsaken your creation, as they have forsaken you. Let them be converted, and behold, you are there within their hearts, within the hearts of those who confess to you, and cast themselves upon you, and weep upon your breast after all their rugged ways. When you gently wipe away their tears, they weep the more and rejoice in their weeping. For you, O Lord, and not a mere man of flesh and blood, you, O Lord, who made them, can remake them and give them consolation. Where was I when I sought you? You were before me, but I had departed even from myself, and I did not find myself, and how much less you. So, he has this really strong picture of the way in which, if any of this is going to work for us, we have to actually be pursued by God himself. And even if we try to run away, he will come after us, and that can be the best thing for us in a sense. Before I keep going, any questions?
How does that work?
How does that work?
Yeah.
How does God pursuing us work? I don't know. So one of the things that he talks a lot about is this pattern of descending first in order to ascend, or I'm just going to put descend and then ascend. So for the Platonists, truth is up here, and we're down here. And through learning, through beauty, through goodness, we sort of climb up and we behold the good, the light, and we see it. We sort of hope to become one with it as we possibly can. Plato is going to also say that our bodies keep us from that. So the more we separate from our bodies and become pure spirit, the more we will sort of be one with the good or God. Sometimes I just do it where I put a parentheses around that. So good or God. What Augustine is going to say we learn about God through Christ is that God doesn't stay up here and wait for us to climb up to him, but that he descends. He comes and makes himself low in order to grab us and bring us back up. So he descends in order for us to ascend with him. But he says that what it actually requires of us is our own descension, our own emptying ourselves in order to rise up to him. And he says that basically the thing that stands in the way is that this is what we want to do first. We want to raise ourselves to either stand on our own foundation or raise ourselves to stand with God, but raise and maybe even think of God as the God that's way up here, and he thinks that that we actually have lost what the whole point of what Christ is, which is that he empties himself and then calls us to empty ourselves.
That's what I always maintained was that Christianity is the only religion where God actually lowered himself.
Yeah.
He said to us, everybody else was trying to climb up to God.
Yeah.
And you can't do it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Through works, through I mean, Islam is definitely like this. God is separated. Yeah, Mormonism definitely. So yeah, this is this is very different from the Greek picture and Roman picture of God, and it's almost an embarrassing one if you think of pride as like the ultimate virtue. And you know, God, you have to ask for and get what you deserve, and the great man does that, you know. And so, I mean, this is why Augustine thinks that even to appreciate the right beauty in the right way, your whole soul has to change. Your whole soul has to love very, very different things. You have to be able to see like beauty in someone who has autism, or you know, someone who's suffering, but like loving through that suffering. You have to be able to see beauty in that, and not just in like the Olympic athlete who does everything perfectly, even though that's given by God too. So here's a passage that gets at this. This is another one of my favorites, and this is, so listen to the metaphor of descent and ascent. And I think good Christian art has this element of descension before ascending in it. So I mean, some of the Christian art that I love the most tends to do this. So
Christian art or art?
maybe good question. Okay, good art.
Okay.
Good art. That's, yes, love it. Okay. But our life came down to us, and he took away our death, and he slew it out of the abundance of his own life. He thundered forth and cried out to us to return hence to him, into that secret place from which he came forth to us. For he came first into the virgin's womb, wherein our human nature, our mortal flesh, was espoused to him, lest it remain forever mortal. And from there he came forth as a bridegroom coming out of his bridal chamber, and he rejoiced as a giant to run the way. For he did not delay, but he ran forth and cried out by words and deeds, by death and life, by descent and ascension, crying out for us to return to him. And he departed from our eyes so that we might return into our own hearts and find him there. He departed, but lo, he is here. He would not stay long with us, and yet he does not leave us. He departed from here, whence he has never departed, for the world was made by him, and he was in the world, and he came into the world to save sinners. My soul confesses to him, and he heals it, for it has sinned against him. O you sons of men, and this is sort of a key part, O you sons of men, how long will you be dull of heart? Even now, after the descent of life to you, do you not wish to ascend and to live? But how can you ascend when you have set yourselves up high and have placed your mouth against heaven? Descend so that you may ascend, so that you may ascend to God. For you have fallen by ascending against God. Yeah, so that last part one more time. But how can you ascend? How can you ascend when you have set yourselves up high and have placed your mouth against heaven? Descend so that you may ascend, so that you may ascend to God. For you have fallen by ascending against God.
So can you vacillate once you acquire inner food? And you still have some of the other?
Absolutely. Yes. So, that's such a good question.
Christians should
Yeah.
be more on the bottom.
Yeah, right. So definitely, no, that's such a good question. So, and I'll tell you a couple things. And I mean, I can't even fully answer it. But one thing that I love in the Confessions is Augustine tells the story of his conversion, and you know, conversion stories are sometimes frustrating because you have like the sinner life and it's horrible, and then conversion, and then it's like, and then I was happy ever after, you know? And like, if you're a Christian, you're like, no, it gets hard. It's like you sign a form for suffering at that point. And the kind of way that you battle sin, it's different. You know, there's freedom in it, but it's there. And so anyway, books 1 through 9 are about that conversion. But what I love is that book 10, he writes 10 years after the fact, and he's asking the question, where am I now? After being a Christian for 10 years, how is my battle with sin the same? How is it different? What does it look like? What are the temptations? And he actually goes through these 3 sins in book 10. He talks about lust, how much he deals with lust, how he deals with curiosity, how he deals with pride. These sections are amazing. But one of the things that he says over and over again at the beginning of each section is, and actually let me find it so I get it exactly right. He says, let's see. Okay. He says, all my hope is found solely in your exceeding great mercy. Give what you command and command what you will. And let me just write that down so you can sort of take it in. Give what you command and command what you will. So he's saying at this point in his life to God, I surrender to you completely. I'm ready to hear anything you ask of me. Ask me, I have to start every day surrendered and ready to give anything. But none of it will I be able to do unless you give the very thing that you command, which is my ability to obey. And that's what changes after his conversion. So before his conversion, it's command what you will, and I'm going to try as hard as I can to get there, but I'm going to fail over and over again and feel ashamed and always feel like I'm lacking in reference to God. Here he's saying, basically, I can't even begin to start obeying you until you give me the ability to do it. And yes, I will fail, but I'm doing it on a foundation of grace now. And that changes everything. Because there isn't earning anymore. There isn't trying to add up, but it's actually fleeing to God who is welcoming you and who loves you so much that he wants to make you new. So, yeah. Okay. I'm going to spend a little time on the downers, because we talked about some really great stuff. I don't think it's totally downer, but sin. You have to deal with sin. What? Oh yeah, I need that. Absent-minded professor. So I just want to talk a little bit about these 3 sins, and I think that with sin, one of the big things is that when you're fighting it as a Christian, you're fighting it not in a way that you are really believing you're going to do it on your own, or that you're doing it to earn Christ's favor. So you're doing it only insofar as God gives you the ability. But I do think that understanding what the most common ones are and kind of being very clever at catching yourself out in your own cleverness is really helpful. And I actually think that some of the best philosophers are the ones that use their intelligence sort of against themselves, in the sense of, well, not against themselves, but against their own trickiness in evading God. So smart people are just really good at evading God. They can come up with brilliant arguments. They can wow you with all sorts of things, and then convince themselves as well. And so the good philosopher is the one who uses that to catch themselves in the most common human evasions of the good. And I think Augustine does that really well. So he basically tells you, here's how I was a sinner. And I think by seeing how he was a sinner, you start to see how you yourself are a sinner too. So the 3 sins that he talks a lot about are lust, curiosity, and pride. And let me actually let me actually read a couple of parts from this. So, 77. Okay. Actually, no, I'm just going to talk to you guys. I'm just going to talk to you. Okay. So lust. Lust, we tend to think of as primarily a sexual sin, but really, for him, it's really just a desire or hunger that goes after things in a way that sort of treats them as a possession or a thing that you're going to enjoy without any reference to what they are in God's eyes, any reference to sort of worshiping your Creator. And so in certain ways, it's just sort of hungry senses looking to fill this vacancy that isn't actually going to be filled, but will almost do it at any cost. And it's interesting. He talks about how these three sins and how they kind of work with one another. So let me just talk a little bit about curiosity, because I think some of these, the way they work, intertwine, sort of comes out a little bit. Curiosity. We like praise this in children, especially. I mean, like, she's so curious. She asks so many questions. It's beautiful, and it is beautiful. I actually think that the Latin term he uses, curiositas, the English translation curiosity isn't quite right. It doesn't really capture what the word he was describing. So curiosity is really just a kind of desire to know without sort of thought of consequences. And this can be and I said a little bit about how lust is primarily, it happens with the five senses. Pride primarily happens in the spiritual part of us. And I think spiritual, intellectual, and I think curiosity is like, it uses both of these. Like it's a combination of the two. So the way in which it can work with the five senses, it's sort of like, I mean, one of the greatest examples is when you have a car wreck on the road and people just all start slowing down and they like want to see the mangled bodies. Like they kind of do. They want to see the degree to which there is, and it's not because they're a doctor and like, oh, I'm a doctor, I could pull over and help this person, or oh, I'm going to start praying for them. Like the better of us do, pray for them. We don't really have to see how mangled the bodies are in order to pray for them. But there's something weird in us that like wants to see, like we just have to see it. And I even think this is sort of the case in these nature films, that the documentaries where like all you see is like animals eating other animals. So like you just see like carnage after carnage after carnage, and like if you were really watching and people are like, oh, but it's just real, like you're seeing what really happens in nature, it's so realistic. But like if you were really seeing what happens in nature, you would see like 10 hours of them doing nothing. And then like them going to the restroom and them like, whatever. So these snippets of them attacking other animals and ripping them to pieces it's not like a giant percentage of their day, but like you have these documentaries where like that's it, like thing after thing after thing, just tearing these animals apart, and like people just love it. So there's something that in us that like desires to know but doesn't want to necessarily be responsible for the consequences of that knowledge. This also was the case with like Nazis during World War II, where the doctors were really curious about research and would conduct their research on the disabled and on Jews and on people with mental illness, because they didn't really consider them human beings, and they just had to know. Like they had to do these experiments so they could figure out, what does this drug do? What does that drug do? And so it was a desire to know without the consequences for that knowledge. If you've read The Magician's Nephew, C.S. Lewis, in that book, the uncle, I haven't read it recently enough. Uncle Andrew is his name. He has these rings, and he doesn't know what they do, and he wants these children to put them on so that he can see what happens to them. And the thing is like they actually might disappear and never return to their parents or their known world or anything. And he kind of doesn't care. Like he just wants them to put. He's not going to put it on himself, but he wants them to put it on so that he can see what happens because he has to know. And it's almost like the ultimate example of curiosity. When I read that, I was just like struck with it. And so Augustine thinks that this is happening to us all the time in like all sorts of different levels. At a very base level, it's in like the movies that we want to see, and like I can't wait to see the gore like at this moment, or I just have to finish this because I have to see how this happens, or gossip. Like when we have to know like what's going on in other people's lives when it's not necessarily something that we should or have to, and we're not going to be responsible for it either. It's not like we're going to go take care of that person or anything, even though sometimes.
TV shows now.
Oh, what? Oh,
The reality TV.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh wow. Yeah. Reality TV shows, ultimate of curiositas. Any kind of voyeurism is a curiositas. So this is for Augustine something that is really, really tricky because you actually can feel pretty good about it. You're like, oh, I just want to know, I'm just sort of becoming well informed, and you really can trick yourself into actually thinking that everything is totally fine. And I actually think that in art, this is big. I think it's sort of big in. I feel like I encountered it in independent films. I got into watching independent films in undergrad, and like went to the film nights with my professor, and it's this very like avant-garde group, and like the weirder the film, the more elite you were, and that kind of thing. And there were things that I saw that I wish I had never seen. But I also was like, I'm so edgy, like, wow, I don't think most people in the world see these things, and whatever, I don't know, and it hit me, so it must be deep, and let's talk about it, and I don't know, and it sort of just creates this curiosity in you. What are these deep people doing with their films? I don't know. Anyway, and it was actually hard for me to just like walk away from even mid film, like decide I'm gonna just turn this off and like not finish it out, because the curiosity had already been piqued to see like what they're gonna do with it, and definitely in the name of like, oh well, this is a great work of art. Like how can you critique it? This person is like a master cinematographer, and it's so well written, and it just shows like the deep seedy side of human nature, and like all these things, and so then you still have to ask, like, what is it doing to your soul, like in the process? And I think a lot of like avant-garde intellectual artist types, especially with independent film, in my experience, like maybe don't ask that question enough. What seeing these images does to their souls, especially when it's done. It's a movie created by a very good director. So, and this might be sort of my experience and not yours, but I definitely think that this is a temptation in the artistic community to a certain extent. So, you can definitely veer on the other side where you're like, oh, I won't be exposed to anything, and like, oh, that has this bad word in it, and I have to stay away. I'm not really talking about that. I think it's sort of the other end of the spectrum. So, yeah.
Read Genesis 3:6.
Okay, sure.
When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she disseminated. She also gave some to her husband. It was with her, and he ate it.
Wow.
The experience you were describing sounds very much
wow.
How the intellectuals or those that are inspired to be intellectuals, we can rationalize anything. And there's one of the many paradoxes of the Bible is the phrase be as innocent as doves and as wise as serpents. And some of that is I see my lovely wife do this with horror movies. She's like, I do not want that in my head.
Yeah, yeah.
And I am unwise. I will watch the movie and then, jump at every
Right.
creak of the house.
Right, right. Yeah. And that's great. I mean, it's just, it strikes me that in that passage it says like a desire, it was pleasing to the eye, which curiosity and lust a little bit, and then desire for gaining wisdom. And again, like, how can you say no to that? You're like, I mean, it was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So I'm going to watch this film or read this book, and I will know evil better and good, maybe, but you still have to ask, like, are you doing this with the desire to know without thought of its consequence? So yes.
That's tricky. I was just thinking of an example, like of Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List.
Yes. Yeah.
So you come away and you're moved and you're drawn
Mhm.
in, but do I really need to see the intense
Mhm.
cruelty and the naked
Right.
body? It's very tricky.
It is. Oh, it
Because
is.
it can seem like a good thing to be reminded of the
Right.
horrific things, and we're told that be reminded.
Right.
But that's kind of tricky.
Right.
Do I really have to? And am I going to see it for that reason?
Right.
Or, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean,
Because you would say it's a beautiful film.
Right.
Well, I don't mean beautiful in the sense.
right. Right. No, I know. And it's interesting because you have different people. I mean, and this is definitely true that there's different levels of sensitivity, and that has to do with your life experiences, what trauma you've encountered, and things like that. But I do hear it. I feel like too often where people will almost pridefully say, "Well, I can handle that stuff." And you're kind of like, well, is that because your soul has become numb to bad things? Do you not react with the amount of horror that you should at darkness? I mean, I think this especially with violent movies where you have people slaughtered and you're like rooting for the good guy, and maybe don't think about like every single person that dies like has a family. And like, there's all sorts of things that follow with that are not they wouldn't entertain you if you actually knew all of those things as well. Yeah.
Those are the three sins, but don't you I want my Muslim women friends to be very curious.
Right.
Have a desire to know the real God without thought of consequence. I want that at the bottom, because a lot of times they could be to death
Right.
with the consequence
Right.
that they possibly. So it's
So-
sin then?
Right. So I think the tricky thing is what you mean by thought of consequence. So if you just mean without thought of consequence, where you're going to take a risk going against the norms of your culture in order to encounter something that could enlarge your soul, you actually are thinking of the consequence. You're actually thinking, I need to do this because this would be good for my soul. So I think the problem is, when it's separated from that entirely. So that's a really good question. So the way that pride plays into this, and so the way pride plays into this, and I'm going to read a passage here, but it often plays into it by thinking that there are situations in which we have these things under control, and we can handle them. And so we put ourselves in situations where these things are enticed, and we're led into much like darker things than we actually saw that we could. Because in pride, we actually thought, I can handle it.
Christy?
Yeah.
We have 4 inadequate minutes.
Okay. So maybe I'll leave off reading this. Okay. So I think that, and as you said, it's a tricky thing. So I'm not going to say we should put movies on a list where like no one should see this or something. I mean, I think it's very ambiguous, and part of this is like learning to read your own heart, and really asking yourself why am I engaging in this, and especially when it comes to entertainment and pleasure and enjoyment. We really shouldn't do anything unless it's to the glory of God. Right? I mean, everything we do should be to the glory of God. And so, and I don't think that's an American idea. I think like we live in an entertainment culture where you work hard all day, and like it's your right to be entertained at the end of the day in order to sort of just deal with getting up and going to work the next day or something. But maybe that part of the day is like the part where your soul needs to be fed the most. Even if you're tired, maybe it's like Augustine, where he's actually hungry for deeper things, but he feels a distaste for them, and he wants these lesser things to sort of placate his sense of hunger and like have a Band-Aid instead of something much deeper. So I think I think that art, and Augustine we talked a lot about earlier, Augustine isn't saying art is bad. He's saying like it's very tricky, just like the Israelites who took the gold out of Egypt and could put it to its right use because God commanded them to. We are to seek out all of the things that are created that are good by artists, by thinkers, and all of that. But the Israelites also made an idol, and we are not that far from that. And maybe it's being aware of our capacity for pride, to not see that we're that close to it, that can lead us into that trap again. So this is fun. Till next time. Okay, thank you.